What if an adult man shrunk down to the size of a microchip? What if he had to fight tiny robots and aliens to survive? What if platform game but on the computer? Welcome back to the Computer Lab. Today we're looking at The Adventures of Microman, a game you probably found on a CD full of other shareware titles, or if you haven't heard of this thing at all, then prepare to learn just about everything there is to know about a game called Microman by Brian Goebel. Microman is a Windows-only platform game released several times between 1991 and 2003. The game was originally a freeware tech demo to show off Brian Goebel's Windows Animation Package, a graphics engine for which the acronym hilariously shortens to WAP, which is famously also the name of a very sex-positive rap song about, among other things, female pleasure and lubricated sexual organs. Goebel made this demo to show off what he called flicker-free sprite animation on Windows in the hopes of having the next big game engine that other devs would license for their own works. But according to an interview in the book Shareware Heroes, which is a pretty hyperbolic title, no one else ended up using it, but there was an awful lot of interest in the game itself, so Brian expanded the demo into a full shareware title called The Adventures of Microman, and followed it by various updates of differing necessity. But while the WAP engine faded into obscurity, Microman kind of stuck around, floating around on floppy disks, shareware compilation CDs, and college intranets the world over. Which is to say, I can find lots of tweets of people vaguely remembering that this game exists, but only a small handful of substantial writing about this thing exists online. And in fact, not to front-load this video with my entire bibliography, but the canon of things written on Microman ultimately comes down to 4 sources. A book about the history of shareware that contains a personal interview with Brian Goebel, which we'll get into later, a defunct website for the band Third Eye Blind, which slowly turned into someone's personal blog, which had an incredibly thorough write-up about the first Microman game. Then there was the site RGB Classic Games, which had a detailed write-up of the first and second Microman games, making it by far the most complete walkthrough of the whole series. And finally, there was an interview with Brian Goebel from a fan site for a game called Blood, a sort of gothic first-person shooter, for which he later programmed on the sequel, Blood 2: The Chosen. And this interview was cited just about everywhere, but it was only available on the Wayback Machine because the original site has been gone for over 10 years. So not only is there virtually nothing written about this game, but the finite amount of writing out there is slowly vanishing into the ether. And that's why I had to make this video. So today, we're looking at Microman in all of its forms, with a focus on version 1.5. So let's do this. In Microman, you walk, jump, and shoot your way through a series of static screens to brave the hazards of a giant circuit board. Or the circuit board is regular sized, but you're small, hence the title. There's boss battles along the way, UFOs that shoot things at you, platforms that appear and disappear at incredibly frustrating intervals, and bottomless pits where you fall until the game over screen. Should you vanquish your foes and reach the end, you'll find a teleporter to the sequel, and that's where the shareware portion ends, and you'll have to mail Brian Goebel a check to access the next part of the game. But that was in the mid-90s. This game is no longer for sale in its original form, and he probably doesn't have the same mailing address anymore, so at least for now, all we have is Episode 1, Crazy Computers. Oddly enough, there's exactly one YouTube video about the sequel game, which is a speedrun shot on a camcorder with the footage inexplicably sped up in Windows Movie Maker, with an amazing end title, so at least one person has played the sequel. But this video is about that first episode, in which you'll encounter such enemies as Robot, Wall Gun, Robo-Dog, Boss Tank, Unarmed Robot, Caterpillar, and Bubble Ship Boss, and these are either the official names or just titles made up by the RGB Classic Games website. There's also 5 power-ups, which mainly change your bullet type and occasionally let you jump higher. Now, this game is hard. Brian Goebel actually listened to feedback and made some of the jumps easier with each release, adding more platforms or springs to generally make the game less punishing, which is nice of him. Also, the controls are arrow keys left-right to move, space to jump, and in the first 2 versions of the game, insert to shoot for some reason. As in the button next to home by the numpad. It's a bad control scheme by modern standards, but hey, it was the mid-90s and it was kind of every programmer for themselves. The rules were still being written. The shoot button was moved to Z for version 1.5 and control for the 2003 update, which was a lot more convenient. And that's basically it. To be honest, Adventures of Microman was much more fun than I remembered it being when I was a bewildered young punk who didn't understand why anyone would choose a game like this over just loading up Nesticle and playing Super Mario Bros. 3 on the old Compaq Presario. But what I didn't know at the time was that Microman was less of a breakthrough for game design and more of a technical marvel for the early days of Windows gaming. Which brings us to Microman predates Microsoft's DirectX in all of its forms, which is partly why this game was created in the first place. If you look at Chips Challenge or Ski Free, two of the most famous Windows 3.1 games, it's pretty obvious that the whole screen is refreshing at a rate of about 6 to 10 frames per second. And it's not smooth. Now keep in mind this was many years after console games were hitting us with speeds our young minds could barely comprehend. Believe it or not, this was pretty much the best you could do on Windows 3.1. Gaming on early Windows machines was something of a controversial subject among PC gamers, since Windows is essentially a graphical interface that runs over top of DOS, and so it ended up hogging a lot of system resources just to run the OS. You're essentially using two operating systems at once, DOS and Windows, and on a 90s computer no less. And while this wasn't a huge problem for simple apps like Clock, Notepad, and the always relevant MS Paint, formerly known as Paintbrush, the consequences were pretty severe for graphically demanding video games, which is why if you look at a late 90s PC game like Tomb Raider, you'll find that it actually didn't support Windows at all. Most players would have to exit out of Windows into DOS mode and then launch the game from there. Windows gaming just wasn't a very appealing option. Even with Microsoft eventually pushing DirectX, it was often still too much of a sacrifice to let Windows run in the background and utilize all that precious RAM and CPU. I mean, you could only spread 8 megabytes of RAM so thin before things start to slow down. Somehow, Brian Goebel put together a graphics engine for 2D Windows games where the sprites didn't flicker every time they updated. I mean, just look at this walk cycle for Microman. That shit is smooth. But, as the story goes, the engine generated a little bit of curiosity from other enthusiasts, but nobody would ultimately license it for their own game. It did, however, make a nice portfolio piece for Brian Goebel, who went on to work for Monolith Productions on games like Blood 2: The Chosen, a spooky little 3D FPS that seems to still have a pretty serious fanbase. And nowadays, Goebel works at a company that does NFT games or something, which is definitely a lasting trend and not just a bunch of tech buzzwords shoved into a casino-style microtransaction thing. Anyway, let's talk about shareware. Microman was released 5 times, initially as a tech demo which was difficult to the point of being nearly unbeatable, then as a proper game, then again with some updates, then updated again with Windows 98 compatibility and some new sound effects, and finally as a higher resolution full-on remake in 2003. Hardly anyone seems to know about that last one. It's actually still available today, although the links to buy the game can only be found on this website that lacks an SSL certificate, so you get this nice friendly security warning before you visit the site. Which is why I wasn't in too much of a hurry to enter my credit card on this page, but anyway, aside from the initial freeware tech demo, all versions of Microman are shareware. As I mentioned earlier, episode 2 was available to people who got busy mailing checks, and a third episode was early in development but got cancelled at some point. These screenshots from Goebel's website are all that seem to exist from that abandoned third episode, and they have an oddly hand-drawn look compared to the pixelated sprite work of episode 1. Now, my big question when I started making this video was whether there was money to be made in a game like Microman. The first part was given away for free, with the second part costing money. And it seems like an awful lot of people played the free part, so how many people wound up paying for the full thing? For those who weren't around for the golden age of WinRAR, shareware is a type of software which is distributed for free as a sort of trial to check out the program. Sometimes it had a 30-day limit, or more often, several of the features were locked out until you paid the developers some money, and they'd send you another CD or a code to unlock the whole thing. If it was productivity software, you'd often be unable to save your work until you forked over the cash. The most well-known example of shareware would either be the aforementioned WinRAR, or id Software's Doom, which included a pretty substantial chunk of the game for free, and you could pay to order the rest. As a movement, shareware is probably best defined as a revolt against what Bill Gates and Microsoft had done to the hobbyist software industry, which is to say, Gates took all the great work that was being done for free at computer clubs in universities across the country, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, and he basically just slapped a price tag on their work. Remember, Microsoft didn't even create DOS, they just bought it and started licensing it to larger corporations. He even sent this obnoxious letter to his friends at the Homebrew Computer Club, telling them that their fun little software experiments were frivolous and insignificant unless they generated revenue, and Gates included his business address at the bottom so people could mail him checks for the programs they had been so carelessly enjoying without monetary penance. What's even more horrific is that Bill Gates likes to apply this logic to things like global poverty and the malaria vaccine. He was a big player in the microloans movement, which advised against donations to economically depressed countries and instead offered what he called strategic investments to get farmers signed up for bank loans with compound interest. Because in his mind, getting everyone wired into the international banking economy was morally superior to just giving someone a goat to feed their family. For better or worse, mostly worse, Bill Gates believes that predatory business practices are the best way to create a more equitable world. And he believes this because he grew up rich in America. So if Microsoft exists at one extreme of an economic model for software, and free and open source software exists at the other, then shareware is somewhere in the middle, still asking for money but in a much less aggressive way than Microsoft, who, for the record, is known to audit small businesses for potential licensing issues and threaten to report them to local authorities if they don't pay up. They're an evil company who hasn't produced a single original thought since literally the beginning. And the fact that Bill Gates thought he was owed something from the very hobbyist communities he exploited is frankly offensive. As a result, the shareware industry emerged made up of developers willing to give their software away for free, possibly with one or two features missing, and asking end users to pay a few bucks to unlock the rest. It's undeniable that Microman's shareware model was functional insofar as it got the game installed onto thousands of computers. Enough people online still mention the game, it was on 90s shareware compilation CDs, and he even made a few sequels to try and keep the momentum going. But as to the big question of whether all this attention led to actual cash money, here's a quote from the book Shareware Heroes. The game soon got picked up for wider distribution on shareware CD-ROM compilations with generic names like Shareware Hits or Exclusive Win Games, thereby massively widening its installed base of players. But Goebel doesn't recall ever making anything more than pizza and beer type money from it. So it looks like this game can be chalked up to an exposure opportunity rather than being a huge moneymaker. But I would like to mention one huge thing that almost happened, and it is pretty big. From that same book, they were tapped by Apogee to collaborate on what would be Apogee's first Windows 3.1 game. They built a prototype called Nuclear Nightmare, then scrapped it and started building a new version of Microman with professional art and sound. When Microsoft and Apogee entered talks for having a game built into Windows 95. But that too fell through when it became apparent there would only be around 150 kilobytes of space for the game, far too little on the Windows installation disks. Which, can you imagine how big this game would have gotten if it was included with every Windows 95 install? Think of how many computers ran Windows 95 across the world, and now picture Microman in the games folder next to Minesweeper and Solitaire. At the very least, this would not be the only video essay on Microman. All in all, Microman was a much more interesting subject than I had expected it to be. It's not the only game I've revisited after being haunted by extremely vague memories of playing it on the old Compaq Presario back in the 2000s, but gosh darn it if this isn't one of the weirder titles in terms of its economics and the nature of its development. How many shareware rabbit holes bring you to a developer's website where they show pictures of every car they owned in the 80s and 90s, or have a special rap song intro they developed for one of the many CD compilations?
I'm here to stay, kicking ass and taking names. I'm Microman.
Incredible. I like to imagine another world in which Microman was bundled with Windows 95, joining the ranks of great pack-in titles like Minesweeper and Chips Challenge. At the very least, we'd 100% have a classic college humor sketch about it. But in real life, at least for now, no such sketch exists, and irony of ironies, Microman was just too big to fit on those install disks. And yes, that is a size pun. If you want to play this game today, it's up on archive.org and you can play it right in the browser, or if you feel like scouring eBay for the elusive copies of Episode 2 on compact disc, please do so and make a video about it so I can watch. Thanks for checking out this episode of Computer Lab Hijinks. Huge thanks to Shareware Heroes and its author for reaching out to Brian Goebel. Thanks to the DOS Games resource as well as this website, which, as I mentioned earlier, originated as a fan page for Third Eye Blind, but for some reason also has a detailed write-up on Adventures of Microman. Websites like this give me faith that the real internet is still out there somewhere. And thanks, of course, to Brian Goebel for giving us the original WAP. Check out this classy photo of him from the original tech demo release of Microman. It's at least 40% frattier than you might expect. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.